I don't want to be living in a place with another selfish person. Like, they're going to see all of my faults too. But that is what this book says is where you grow the most. What is up, ladies? Welcome back to my channel. I'm Emily, and I create Christ-centered conversations about topics missing from mainstream messages. So if that's your cup of tea, make sure to subscribe. And while you're at it, if you want to follow along with the behind-the-scenes stuff of my life, just kidding, that's super rude. Why do I do that? If you want to follow along with the behind-the-scenes stuff of my life, you can follow me on Instagram, which will be linked down in the description box below. Without further ado, let's get into the video. Today's video is a fun one and an interesting one because I've had a love-hate relationship with dating, relationship, marriage books. Particularly because I would read them and I'd be like, this is awesome, but I'd be 13. So that was an issue. But yeah, so if you're thinking about dating, if you're ready to date, if you're ready to get married, if you're engaged, anywhere in that relationship spectrum, I want to share with you some of my favorite relationship books, the ones that have helped me the most and the ones that I would recommend to others. I will say, actually, I'll just say that when I get there. Some of these have some caveats. First half is going to be dating books. Second half is going to be marriage books. And with my lovely commentary in between. So, book number 1 for dating is called Boy Meets Girl. And this one has a huge caveat, so just hear me out. So this is by Joshua Harris, who is now an apostate, which means he has denied the faith and walked away from Christianity. But he wrote this book when he said that he was a Christian. So there's Christian messages in it. It uses scripture. The warning that I would say is understanding that this man may not be a Christian, and so the book may not actually be a Christian book. So I would just, if that does not sit well with you, don't read this book. But I'm gonna say the reason why I recommend it is simply because it worked for me. That's not always a good thing, but I had a good experience with it. It was helpful in some of the tips, specifically in tips about communication and about starting a relationship. So the whole premise of the book is actually just about an idea of courtship, which some people totally about. I don't find it that repulsive. It's just an interesting new way of thinking about dating. You can still call it dating, but the way that it's done is so different from dating around or dating unintentionally. So it's really about like, how are we gonna date well? And so if you're prone to legalism, I might say, stay away from this book. Maybe I'll say that. Because it doesn't really give as much of a big picture of like, why do we date? Why do we do the things we do? It's more like practical, helpful. How do I go on a first date? Do I ask her dad? What kind of questions can I ask? How far is too far? You know, the classic dating stuff, but it takes it from a much different perspective, which I appreciated that perspective. The thing that helped me realize is that dating is for marriage, and I'm a Christian, so I don't have to date like the world does. And I shouldn't be dating exactly as the world does. And that was encouraging to me, knowing that, you know, like, my relationship might look different from everyone else's, and that's okay. Book number 2. I will say I have not read this book, but I have heard wonders about it. And I trust the author, and I trust the people who have recommended it to me. So that's why I'm recommending it. It's called Not Yet Married. I think it's by Marshall Segal or something like that. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. That is about and for anyone who is not yet married. So that would be single, dating, engaged. If you're not married, you fall into that category. And it's broken up in a really good, unique way so that it is important and relevant for any one of those people. I think that book too also gives more of a God-honoring perspective maybe than Joshua Harris's book does, where his was more practical and maybe a little legalistic, you could say. This one more has a focus on what glorifies the Lord in your relationship and in your singleness. Number 3, this is a very practical book. This is called 101 Questions to Ask Before You Get Engaged. And I love this book. It is so interesting. It's literally just a book of like 101 questions. But they're like interesting questions. They're questions like, now I have to think of some because I should have like brought the book. That would be smart. Some classics like, how would you deal with finances? What was your parents' relationship like? What did conflict look like in your home growing up? Stuff like that. Some of it is like, do you tithe to a church? Some of it is actually for people who have been previously married, so they have questions specifically for that. If you have kids, it talks about parenting, it talks about parenting styles, it talks about sports. Did you do sports? It talks about, are you an introvert and an extrovert? So it goes across this whole range of really interesting questions, from things that like you could ask your friend to things that like you really want to know in, is this going to be my future spouse? That is super interesting and very practical. It's one of those books that for a while I actually just like kept it in the middle console of my car, because when I was in the car with Hunter, I was like, what should we do? Let's read, and open up to a question, random question. I was like, all right, I'll ask you this. And we'd have a really good conversation about it. So it was a conversation starter for us, and they ask really good questions that you might not think about asking if you're just like sitting there and you're like, I don't know. What do you want to know? All right, second section, we're going to talk about marriage books. Before I talk about marriage books, a huge caveat to this is it is so important to know yourself and to recognize what your limits are in terms of reading books about marriage. For me, I really had to rein it back in. You know, I totally read marriage books way too early, and so I had like all these ideas in my head, but I was like years out from being married. I mean, even now, I'm not engaged. And so it might be more in my future to be reading marriage books, but certainly not when I was in high school, certainly not when I was in middle school. So that's my huge caveat. This can become an idol, so please be careful if you start to read marriage books. It can just be something that as a different way of like fantasizing about marriage. But anyway, if you can do it, if marriage is in your future and you can read these books well and you know yourself in that way, also ask for accountability if you feel like you can't. Here are some books for you. 1, The Meaning of Marriage by Timothy Kelly. Timothy Kelly. Oh my gosh, I knew someone in my grade named Timothy Kelly. That's awkward. Tim Keller is what I meant to say. The Meaning of Marriage by Tim Keller. So this is a book that's recommended all the time. I bet if you looked up any other video on this topic, this is probably the book that would come up too. It is so interesting and it is so biblical. It is so just based in scripture and based in the gospel. Like that is what is so good about this book, is that it is all revolving around the gospel. It's like, what is marriage? We can't even answer that question until we say, what is the gospel? And then how does marriage show people, show each other what the gospel is? It is a wonderful book. It really just is such a different perspective and such a godly, Christ-honoring, Christ-exalting Christian book. So that I would totally recommend. Also, it's also really readable and very interesting because he shares a lot of stories from his own marriage that just makes it so much more relatable. And you're like, wow, that's crazy. Like a lot of these stories, I still think about to this day, and I'm like, that's funny. The second book is called Sacred Marriage. It's by Gary Chapman, I think. And it is also so interesting. I guess I really like these books. Now that I'm talking about it, I'm like getting hyped. So this book is about the point of marriage and the fact that the main premise of the book is that marriage is to make you holy, not happy. The goal of marriage is for your sanctification. It's a sacred thing. That's why it's called sacred marriage. It's not just for fun. It's not just to make babies. It's not just to have a good time in the bedroom. It's not any of those things. Though those are aspects of it, it's not just somebody to live with. It's not just somebody to lean on, to go through hard times with. It is someone chosen by God who will shape you and grow you according to his will. And so you both in this relationship are shaping each other, but the problem is you're sinful, selfish people. And so you're together. And so it's actually making you holy. It's very difficult. And so he just has a very honest way of talking about marriage and the point of marriage from a Christian perspective, but also just from a really, like, this is how it is. And it's a good thing. And so kind of trying to shape and like rewire our brains to think like, oh my gosh, because normally when I think about marriage, even to this day, I'm like, if it's hard, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. Like, that's scary. I don't want to be living in a place with another selfish person. Like, they're going to see all of my faults too. But that is what this book says is where you grow the most, is when you're with somebody else who loves you and cares about you and will not leave you and sees all of your faults and loves you for it anyway and shows you the love of Christ. And that's where we get sanctified, and that's how we become holy. So I would strongly recommend that book too. The last book is called Love That Lasts. I don't know the author of it, and I haven't actually read it, but the reason why I'm recommending it is because I trust my pastor and he recommended it to Hunter and I. And what it does, this one is different, a little different than the other two about marriage that I talked about. This one specifically talks about men and women. This one specifically talks about men and women's roles in marriage. So this is coming from a complementarian perspective. So if you're egalitarian, that's okay. I mean, it's still a great book. You can totally read it. But just all cards on the table, that's the perspective that it brings. And so that I'm hoping to read probably when I'm engaged, Lord willing, to prepare myself to be specifically a wife. Like, what does God ask for me as a woman, as a wife, to my husband? So that's a good book for that. And those are all my books. Not all of them. I've read a lot more, but those are the ones that I would strongly recommend for dating and for marriage. Let me know in the comments down below, have you read these books? Also give me more recommendations because I really like reading. So if you have more recommendations, leave them down in the comments below. And I guess that's all I have. Have a great week, have a great life, and I'll see you next week.